How's the morning looking, Daniel?
Morning looks great. Thanks for asking.
We'll take it. What are we talking about on this great looking morning?
I want to talk about financial planning for a quote unquote straightforward situation, financial planning by decades, and one time financial plans versus ongoing relationships.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it.
Okay, you've decided to bore our audience to tears by talking about financial planning itself, not planning topics, but the act of financial planning. So, take us away. What terribly boring thing are we going to talk about first?
I'm sure there's an audience for it. But first, I want to talk about, a lot of people either in the community or come to us say, my situation's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot going on. It's pretty simple. So I want to, pose a quote unquote straightforward situation to you and see where we can dive into a situation such as this one and say, okay, maybe it's not so straightforward, and maybe there are items we aren't considering. So to give you some context, let's say there's a family in their 40s. Both spouses work, earn healthy incomes. They don't have a spending problem. They recognize they need to live below their means. They are saving for future goals, and they have a good vision for what it may look like. They want to retire by 62, let's say. They're saving what they believe is an adequate amount for those goals. They have a good investment perspective. They're not looking at their accounts every single day. They recognize that they want to set it and forget it, more or less. They have two children, let's say. They're saving for their two respective college educations, and they feel like their life's pretty much on autopilot, right? They have the right inputs, and they just need to kind of cruise with what they're currently doing. If I'm to pose you a hypothetical like this one here, what items maybe are we not considering, or should we plan around in this straightforward situation here?
Okay. You're going to have to stop me at some point because you did list out what, at face value, sounds like a very simple situation in planning context, right? You didn't lead with a complex issue or problem. So, as I get into this, please feel free to just jump in and stop me because I'm going to probably go for a while otherwise. So, first and foremost, you said this is a married couple. We have two children. Immediate questions on the family dynamic. How old are these children? What are their academic prospects? What are we thinking about in terms of where they're going to go to school, how much school we're going to pay for, what are the terms and conditions for that support, or conversely, what is the driver to the lack of support that comes behind that? When we start getting into that as well, what are sort of the necessary costs and situational items for these kids? So, do these kids have any health conditions that we're worried about? Are we supporting them in any of those particular means and ways? And then as we circle back to sort of the actual parents here, similar sorts of questions, right? Just because we're in our 40s doesn't mean we're done with our own sort of personal journey with respect to things like education or necessary expenditures. So, are there any illnesses in the family? Are there any disabilities in the family? Are there any pressing concerns within the family dynamic subject to questions about, let's say, the parents, which we've talked about on the podcast before? But, are both of your parents still alive? How are they doing? Are they financially independent? Is their health in a place where they're going to be okay, for the foreseeable future? Or do we have concerns about needing to support them either financially or directly, having them move in with us? All of that just touches on the immediacy of who are these people. And I'm not even getting into their actual jobs and careers and the prospects there. We're not talking about their portfolios yet. We're not talking about their risk management insurance picture yet, their estate planning yet. We're not talking about any of their actual goals and objectives. I'm just really trying to figure out, like, who are you, before we even really start to get into actual numerical things. Because even something like how much college do you want to support, like, there's a number behind the answer to that question, but there's usually more of a principle, right? I want to take care of my kids. I don't want them to go to school with student debt. Or conversely, I paid for my own way, my kids should pay for their own way, and I'll help them along, but I'm not going to do much for them. Or we agreed to pay for 2 years of public school, so if they go to private school, it's more on them. And then what benchmarking of public school are we talking about? Are we talking about in-state low cost? Are we talking about in-state high cost? Are we talking about out of state? So just out of the gate, just in the immediacy of understanding this family and their dynamic, there's a whole bunch of questions that the simple situation you presented doesn't actually explain to me or answer to me.
I think that's a good point. It's not just the two, people that come in for the meeting. It's everything that branches off from that. It's, do you have parents that are still with us? If so, is there planning that needs to be talked about there? Or, are there children, and who are these children? And kind of thinking through that. On the college side, thinking about it a little bit more, we work with a lot of folks who make good money, what they wouldn't consider great money. And every once in a while I hear somebody say, I don't know, they might go to a public in-state school, they might go out of state private. I'm willing to pay for what we're willing to save. Do you think that's an adequate answer in this regard?
I don't think it's an adequate answer. Like I follow the logic here, which is at the end of the day, we'll save as much as we save and we'll spend as much as we've saved. And that's sort of what we're willing to commit to. That's sort of an input-driven decision framework versus an outcome-driven decision framework. Because if your philosophy has been, let's say, every month we're just going to put $100 away per kid at a 529 or something like that, you're going to pay for an amount of school. And it's hard to plan around an amount of school. Now, you can make the argument that's a budgetary decision. Hey, we've got $40,000 for your education. How you use it is up to you, kid. But the problem is that really forces the kid into making a decision based solely on a univariate item, which is, here's your budget. Stretch it as far as you can, sort of becomes the de facto thought that comes with that. But here's sort of the balancing act. Let's say the choice is I've got $40,000 with which I could probably pay all the way through a bachelor's degree at a community college, or I've got $40,000 and I got into MIT. And that $40,000 is probably not going to cover more than freshman year, but I got into MIT, right? Like I have potentially enormous potential in my career and my earning capabilities and so on by getting into such a top tier school, provided I'm going to study electronic engineering and not English at MIT. No offense to the English majors at MIT. I just don't think it's probably the right school for you. And so in that context, you have to contemplate that something like we'll give them as much as we save is kind of a bad framework to build your philosophy around supporting your children with, even though it may be the pragmatic and practical limitation to the support you can offer.
Okay, so in a situation like that, would you push a client to, pursue an outcome or articulate one that they want for the child?
I think the outcome is more recognizable. So saying like, look, I will pay for half of any college you go to for the first 4 years, right? And that can be a wide variety of value, right? Again, back to community college versus private school, but at least it's something where you're saying, my philosophy here is I want my kid to have skin in the game. I want them to, take on the financial responsibility for their education. And so if they get scholarships, great, it's more paid for. If they don't, that's a loan they have to take out. And now they need to be a little bit more thoughtful about the costs they're incurring and the return on that investment. My philosophy might be, I'll get you through an associate's. Everything past that is up to you. And so it's just a accomplishment level, and it's sort of vague about how long that takes or kind of what the financial obligation there is, but it's a very specific outcome. I think that is easier to work with, because also what we want to think about is, what are we incentivizing, right? What is the outcome we're trying to produce? And so in that particular regard, we have to remember that education is an investment in human capital. And so when we say to our kids, like, hey, I'll pay for all your college, just go out there, have a great time, we're not necessarily incentivizing obtaining an education that improves our future human capital. We're incentivizing studying something that interests us. And there's nothing wrong with studying something that interests you. But as I like to say, as a person who has a bachelor's degree in history, I could have read the books on my own. I did not have to pay the school to tell me to read books on the Cold War and various things like that. And so it's just certain subjects and fields where you want to be careful about what you're incentivizing in terms of how you then describe how you're going to accumulate towards that objective. And bear in mind, Daniel, we're now, 7-8 minutes into this conversation, and we still haven't gotten off of like kids' college education and the parents. We still haven't talked about risk management, the portfolio, the estate plan, career objectives, earning capacity, any of this other stuff.
Yeah, you beat me to it. But this is a conversation that we can and have had before and can continue for the duration of the podcast. But let's transition a little bit. There's other areas that aren't so straightforward or haven't been brought up yet that I think are worth it, whether it's insurance, estate planning, or just your vision for the future. moving forward from some of the things we've already talked about, what do you think is something else we should be looking at here?
Let's talk about something more interesting than college. Let's talk about the investments, right? So you described it, if I recall correctly, as they're interested in sort of taking a set it and forget it approach, not being too active or engaged. That's great. That's a great baseline philosophy. I'm super excited that that's their philosophy around their investments. That does not mean that that's what's happening currently. So the immediate questions for analysis that are going to come up in investing: how much are we saving? Where are we saving? Why are we saving that amount? Are we saving into business retirement plans or employer retirement plans that provide a match? Are we self-employed and therefore taking advantage of savings vehicles that are appropriate for us? If we're self-employed, do we have employees, or is it just a solo practice or solopreneur business? Because it's going to affect the type of retirement plan that we have access to. If we're doing that, then what is our philosophy around that? Does the retirement plan exist for our employees? Does it exist for us? Are we funding it with regular contributions, or are we doing this post hoc year-end sort of planning where we're just doing a tax-driven type of savings? Because that can be very good for tax planning, but maybe very bad for wealth accumulation and retirement planning purposes. Let's assume they're just W-2 employees of other businesses, organizations, whatever the case is. Okay, great. Again, what is the nature of the retirement plans and benefits that are offered at these particular employers? What de facto predicates are assumed in the retirement savings, right? Am I saving into a 401k plan where I need to do the driving with regard to investment selection and wealth accumulation? Am I paying into something like PARA or another formal pension or defined benefit plan where there's just sort of a default outcome? What does that do to my career options, right? If I've been working for 10 years or 15 years at the same employer and it's a defined benefit type of plan, am I sort of married to that? Is that hampering my career choices or prospects because now I have this sort of vested interest in a particular retirement plan that may not treat me very well if I leave earlier than otherwise expected by the structure of that plan? Then let's get into the actual investments themselves. Are these high quality investments? So do they not necessarily perform at the top of the pile, every single year, because no investment does that, but are they, passive index funds? Are they low cost? Do they have a consistent track record of generalized performance, not necessarily, again, being in the first place, but more importantly, not being at the bottom of the pile with any regularity or even infrequently? In terms of that, do we have consistent management over time? If it's index based, do we have good tracking error, right? Do we have a really low tracking error where the fund is really matching its index quite well? Are we diversified? Do we have an appropriate level of risk and reward in this particular portfolio or across the various investment accounts and portfolio assets for this client that is not only appropriate for their age, but also for their objectives? And more importantly, are we allocated in such a way and saving at such a rate that we should arrive at an outcome, in this case, financial independence, let's say, that is going to, be adequate to obtain that outcome without taking undue risk, right? So are we appropriately balanced at our current stage of life to arrive at the outcome at the right time in the right place and so on? And then what other types of compensation come into this? Do we have a stock purchase plan? Do we have stock options? Do we have equity compensation like RSAs, RSUs? Do we have incentive stock options? How does that play into this portfolio mix? Have we been buying and holding the equity options or receiving the RSUs and just holding on to them? Have we been liquidating and diversifying? And then we get outside of the workplace and the compensation stuff here. What other types of assets do we have? Have we inherited money? Do we have a brokerage account? What is it invested in? Have we done something alternative like rental properties or crypto? What is our cost basis in these? Do we have mortgages, liabilities, margin accounts, balanced up against the value of these assets? And if we're not trying to drive, if we come back to this philosophy thing where we'd like to set it and forget it, again, that may not be what we've been doing so far, or all of this assumes that we've sort of been doing it right-ish. But what if we've been doing it wrong? What if we thought we had this nice set it and forget it passive portfolio approach? We've actually just been sitting in money market accounts in our 401ks, and we put money into our IRAs, and we made the classic investing mistake. We said, what's the rate of return on an IRA, as opposed to what's the rate of return on the assets I can buy in the IRA? And so we just threw money into an account and never did anything with it. What if we're over leveraged on some of our real estate or business holdings? What if we lent money to a family member and now that's technically sort of an asset that we have, but there's an interpersonal dynamic about getting our money back from them? So I'll stop there and quit getting too far ahead of myself here. But again, you propose this simple situation. They're a married couple. They're saving in their company retirement plans. They want to have a passive, set it, forget it approach. Doesn't mean that's what they're doing so far. Doesn't mean that we're able to just switch to that instantaneously now that we're having a conversation about it. And with all of that in mind, we may or may not be aligned already to accomplishing the actual goals, which we haven't even talked about goals.
All right, that's a lot. I think one of the themes I'm picking up here is okay, great. What are you doing? Why are you doing it that way? And what is the outcome we're looking to achieve? I think in situations like this, it's not uncommon for us to speak with some folks and ask some pretty, generic questions such as, okay, great. You're saving a good amount. Why are you saving that exact amount? And is that exactly the amount that needs to be saved in order for you to have the desired outcome by your desired age? And oftentimes it's more just, oh no, it's been on autopilot and that's just the amount people told me to save me. And it seems like not even getting into the goals yet, just looking at the investments, the investment structure, the intention behind the investments, and reverse engineering that toward what the goals are is something that might be overlooked in a simple situation.
And I mean, keeping in mind here, the goals may or may not be tenable through the investment lens, right? So there's this comic that used to be on the wall when I worked at Waddell and Reed in the printing room. It's just this little single panel comic, and it's two guys sitting across each other from a desk, and the guy who's talking says, I retire next week and I've saved nothing. Now's your chance to become a legend. And like you're smiling at that, and I'm internally laughing. But the big thing here is that sometimes people have not done the work, right? So again, simple situation here, but what if all we've done is contribute what the employer matched in our retirement plan? Maybe they offered a really simple match of, let's say, just 3%. And so they were putting in 3%, we were putting 3% in. We've been saving 6% of our income, generally speaking, since our mid-20s. We're now in our 40s. Are we on track to be able to retire comfortably? Maybe. And if we're lower income, it's actually probably more likely that we're on track than if we're higher income. Because if we're lower income, we've probably always been some version of lower income. And so that means Social Security will do more lifting for us. If we have a defined benefit plan, that'll do more lifting for us. And we don't need to replace as much of our income because of that. But if we've had this nice progression of career advancement where we went from, 40,000 starting to 60 to 80 to 100 to 140 to 200, et cetera, in that situation, right, chances are if we've only been saving at the same percentage the whole time, we've steadily fallen behind on how much we need to save because we have not been increasing our savings rate commensurate with our income. We've just kept it as the same proportion of a steadily larger pie. And that sounds like that'd be adequate, but the problem is that our lifestyle will be based on our career ending income, not our career starting income.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to the whole just doing things on autopilot, right? Generic advice being take your employer match is inherently good advice. It's your money and you should take advantage of it. Doesn't mean that's the amount you need to save for your desired goals and outcomes.
Yeah, and I mean, in that same context, we could, as you've already noted, we could spend the rest of the podcast nitpicking the insurance and the estate and all these other factors and facets here. I know we have other topics you want to get to at some point here, so you can stop me if you want. But when I look at something like risk management, we have our intern here with us who just joined us last week, Cecile, and she and I have spent some time working on second quarter planning meetings for clients where we are typically looking at things like cash flow, insurance, estate documents, and just revisiting goals and objectives. And over and over and over again, as we look at these insurance documents for clients, existing clients, we've looked at their insurance documents before and advised them on them before. What we're finding is weird inconsistencies, right? You have extra coverage on this policy, you have no coverage on that policy. You have too much homeowners, you don't have enough auto coverage, right? You have a second driver in your house that's not you or your spouse, and how does that attach or relate to your particular coverages? And again, like, these are not new clients who are coming in out of the cold, but we're still finding in multiple cases that there's things that need to be addressed. Even though last time we looked at this, when they first became a client, or last year during the same second quarter cycle, right, there are little ticky tack things that can change on your insurance policies year over year that are easy to miss or omit when you are not looking for them or not being systematically reminded to keep an eye on it.
No, you're completely correct. It's one of the reasons we have to monitor and review them. I don't think insurance planning or just reviewing insurance documents is something a lot of clients enjoy, and they pay us to do it for them, right? So it's important to make sure we're covering that base for them. I'd say in addition to everything we've already discussed, right, just to wrap the topic up, can you list off just maybe other areas that we haven't even discussed and maybe not get into detail, but things that someone that thinks their situation is straightforward should consider and use as a checklist almost?
Sure. I mean, just to run through the risk management items real quick, right? I already touched on sort of the home auto. Do you have an umbrella policy behind your home and auto, right? What would happen if you were to rear end a Lamborghini or hit a school bus? Not just damage the vehicle, but the passengers and occupants. What happens if you're a little bit at fault versus seriously at fault? Life insurance. Do you have a spouse who depends on your income? Do you depend on your spouse's income? Right. Most people are going to have a level of need that is greater than 100% of either of their individual incomes because you share an income and share finances. Disability insurance. A lot of people completely forget about it because we don't see ourselves as people who will become disabled, become sick, become injured. But how adequate is that coverage? Is your employer paying for that coverage? And if so, what is the after-tax benefit versus if you were able to pay for it, what is the pre-tax benefit? Because if you pay for it, it's not taxed. If they pay for it, it is taxed. Long-term care, not just your long-term care, but your parents' long-term care, right? Are you adequately insured for this, or do we have a cash reserve that can adequately fund it? Do our parents have that, or are we going to have to take care of them at some point? Do they live in our state, which Colorado is not a filial responsibility state, or do they live in a different state like Pennsylvania, where it is a filial responsibility state, where the state's going to send you, the kids, a bill if your parents have to be paid for by the government for that sort of care situation? Estate planning, even individuals, unmarried, no kids, etc., need estate planning documents because, as we touched on the podcast recently, everybody has an estate plan. It's just that the government wrote it for them and didn't think about them when they wrote it if they don't write their own estate plan. And have you consulted the appropriate professionals to get that in place, or did you download a PDF online and just type in some stuff in a field and who knows if it's actually enforceable or correct and so on? Cash flow, right? Are we receiving income in the most efficient and effective manner? Are we allocating our income in the most efficient and effective manner? Debt, right? Liabilities, student loans, mortgage, auto issues, right? Taking out second loans like HELOCs. In that particular sense, again, should we be paying it down faster? Should we be paying it down as slowly as possible? What do we do with the difference between the excess money we can use to apply in that in one way or the other? We're now in retirement. We have no debt. Should we be taking on debt in retirement? Is that a good tool for us to use in the retirement income picture? So, I mean, on and on and on and on, right? Everybody sort of is the fish in the water that says, what's water, right? All of us feel like our situation is simple because we already understand it. We understand who we are, where we are, what's going on, but recognize that blind spots are the number one reason that financial planning as a formal process is beneficial, because at the end of the day, the definition of a blind spot is a thing you're unaware of. And unfortunately, no matter how hard you work on it, you will always have some blind spots.
All right. Makes that straightforward situation seem not so straightforward, I guess. But I think that's more than enough for the topic for now. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit here and talk about financial planning by decade. So, as a firm, we're very lucky. We work with folks all the way from their 20s till their 70s sometimes, and even advanced age. And I know rules of thumb can be sort of tricky, but maybe some things each decade that someone should start to consider, have in place, or use as a checklist as well. I wanted to start with just the decade of your 20s, and I know that's a decade of a lot of change for a lot of folks. But what are some things that you should start to, as either a 21-year-old, 25-year-old, or 29-year-old, start to consider, have in place to build a solid foundation for yourself?
I think the biggest things that you can really focus on in your 20s are improvement of your human capital, right? So if you didn't go to college or a trade school or something, that you are going to college or a trade school. I mean, that part's sort of straightforward. There are some people who can get away with being quote unquote unskilled labor, where they find kind of niche markets or niche places to do it in. But just generally speaking, it's a good thing to invest in your human capital early on because you'll reap the rewards of that throughout your lifetime. Other things are really controlling your cash flow. A lot of people, when they transition from being in their parents' home to being on their own and they kind of get their first adult job, as it were, sort of make the common mistake of sort of treating all of their income as spendable, right? And so it helps to try to maintain some of the skills you had from being a teenager or from having roommates in school, which is to be really cognizant of restricting your spending early on so that you don't immediately inflate your lifestyle to the very first job you get that pays you quote unquote real money. And in that context, then, going ahead and establishing some deliberate rules for how you're going to deal with your income, right? Are you going to try to get to the point where you're maxing out your retirement savings as early as possible in your career so that you're taking advantage of that long long term, or are you going to use ratio rules, like you're not going to spend more than 30% of your pre-tax income on your housing, and you're going to make your housing decisions based on that affordability versus lifestyle factors like convenience, being walkable to work or something like that, or getting to live in a nice place, as opposed to letting your finances drive that. I think other things to really contemplate early on that sort of come at young people pretty quickly: relationship costs. Whether you're dating, whether you're in a long-term relationship, both are expensive, right? Dating is expensive from an activities, dinners, outfits, yada yada sort of standpoint, let alone taking your first vacation together and doing those sorts of things. But also the relationships of your peers. I think all of us in our 20s go through this phase where suddenly it seems like all of our friends are getting married, and maybe we're one of the friends who are getting married as well. But in that timing, those trips, those wedding trips, bachelorette trips, tuxedos, dresses, all the things that go with that can be thousands of dollars that were never going to be in your budget. And yet suddenly you find yourself spending 10% of your income to go to these celebrations of your friends. So just being mindful that there's a lot of kind of ambush expenses that come along there. And then functionally trying to build the foundation of good financial habits, right? Getting an emergency fund in place, starting to fund your retirement account for the first time, getting good health insurance from your job, and then trying to build up an HSA or a savings account so you can start getting lower quality health insurance and start saving the difference, right? All these little things that essentially create the foundation for how our financial reality is going to be in the following decades.
To touch on two of those points there, this is the decade that I'm in, and I think it's where a lot of my friends are as well. So it's easy for me to resonate with. I hear a lot of people that I know say, well, why should I save? I can only save $20 a month into my Roth IRA. That's not even worth it. And I think something to be cognizant of in this decade is it's not so much about the dollar amount as it is about building the habit. It's getting the habit built of paying yourself first for the long term, delaying a little bit of gratification so that future you has a great sum of money to live off of at a certain time in their life. I think something else to be cognizant of in this decade is the amount of time you have. So not only time to watch assets grow and compound, or to find someone you want to spend your life with, or think about what you want a career to be. It's also a great time to take risks. Take myself, for example. I moved halfway across the country a little bit over a year ago. If it didn't work out and I didn't want to be here, I'm still 24. I can just move on somewhere else. And I don't have a kid. I don't have a mortgage. I don't have a wife. So there's really not a ton of harm in that regard. And the only thing that would hurt is my ego and my wallet, because I have to move again. But I have so much time to make up the difference, as opposed to someone who's in their 50s. Starting a business or making a career transition is going to be considerably harder than it is for me. So if you're in your 20s, take more risk, realize the unique advantage you have, because you won't have it when you're 40 or 50.
Well, that's sort of an interesting framing around the taking the extra risks as well. I'm actually a little bit of the disposition that your 30s is sort of a good mulligan decade. And what I mean by that is maybe you studied the wrong thing in school, or you went and worked at the wrong place the first time. Maybe you had a long-term relationship that didn't work out. Like, life's very individualized, obviously, and everybody's going to be able to point to an exception to this. The taking risk, particularly when I think about something like entrepreneurial risk, our society has this sort of fascination with like young savants. We're always sort of looking for like a Zuckerberg type who creates an enormous company in their early 20s. And, culturally, we all sort of aspire to be that in some form or fashion, or we sort of idolize that. I think, assuming that you're not going to be at the end of the distribution, the outlier of outliers, I think for a lot of people, it makes sense when we talk about the human capital context to go ahead and master a craft. Like I'm much more bullish on, for example, somebody like you spending your 20s becoming a really good financial planner, or somebody going to undergrad, going to law school, and then spending 4 or 5 years in a law firm really learning something about criminal law or business law or mergers and acquisitions, and then as they get into their later 20s or into their 30s, leveraging that foundation of experience to take an even bigger risk like entrepreneurship or something like that than I am for the person who graduates from college and immediately starts a business. Because it's not so much that you won't reap the rewards, that you couldn't bounce back from the loss or the risk that you took there. but I'm always mindful of the amount of experience you don't have at a certain point in your life relative to the amount of experience you accrue, even with just a couple years of foundational work spent. And again, that's where I say that 30s are sort of a good mulligan year. Maybe you find the better relationship at that time. Maybe you didn't buy a house yet, but now it's probably time to start getting serious about your real estate decisions by your 30s, if not already. Or if you've had kids, right? In your 20s, as a lot of people do, your kids are now getting to a point where they're going to go to school instead of being in daycare. So there's little things like that where there's a bit of fungibility between the 20s and 30s. But I think in the continuity of the 20s and 30s, you probably in most cases have made a lot of the foundational decisions that are going to be sticking with you long term. And again, you have some opportunity to take risks and bounce back. And the worst thing that happens here is you have some credit card debt or something like that. But just generally speaking, I'm sort of mindful that the 20s is sort of a building phase, and the 30s is maybe going from your draft to your final draft sort of phase when it comes to that. Not to say you can't make different life changes in your 40s, 50s, 60s, just that is sort of the opportune time to ideate and build a foundation and fix some mistakes you made along the way and kind of really build out where you're going to end up long term.
It's a great point. So if the 30s are considered the final draft, what are some other things financially someone should be thinking of in this decade?
At this point, it's similar to sort of the conversation we had about the simple plan earlier. The biggest things that are going to happen here is this is where we start to approach kind of the point of no return for long-term financial commitments. Meaning, if I get to 40 and I haven't really started to build up retirement savings contributions, if I have had kids at any point in my 20s or my 30s, and I've not started seriously thinking about how I'm going to pay for their college, or at least how I'm going to support them when they transition to adulthood outside of my home at some point. If I haven't, taken seriously investments in my human capital to improve my earning capability, so on and so forth, I'm now rapidly approaching the time of life, 40s and 50s, where I'm going to have to start to live with my failure to plan ahead. And so, I emphasize that it's sort of the final draft phase, but it's also sort of the last opportunity to get the best bang for your buck for some of those longer term activities. Because if we, let's say, wait until our 40s to buy a house, or we wait until our 40s to start saving for retirement, or wait until our 40s to start saving for our kids' education, assuming we've had kids in our 30s or somewhere in our 20s, then we are going to end up eating the costs of that pretty much at face value when those costs occur later on, as opposed to having used the value of time to accumulate some wealth or resources to help do some of the lifting for us longer term.
It's one of the reasons I love working with families in their 30s. Usually they have a lot of moving pieces and exciting items going on, but also because one, time is still on their side, and two, it's one of those decades where when you start to put the proper inputs in place, their plan starts to take off because you're taking advantage of time and the life stage they're in. I'd say the 40s and 50s are also a great time to do this. However, the 30s are typically when people start making those big purchases. They have the big decisions. They're usually deep enough in a career at this point where they feel good about the money they're making and the expertise they have. So moving a little bit towards, say, the 40s or even the 50s, if we wanted to lump them together, are there things in these decades that are now different, or do you consider these almost like autopilot years at that point?
I think 40s and 50s are actually distinct enough to discuss separately. So I'm not going to lump them together the same way that I've sort of lumped the 20s and 30s. By the 40s, you have probably picked your career path, right? And some people do change. I also particularly think of certain categories like military service members who might have gone from 18 to 38 or 22 to 42 and put in their 20 years. And now they might go through a military retirement and then pivot to a completely different career field. So there's certain cases like that. But at this point, you've probably been in your field for over a decade, if not up to 2 decades. You've built a foundation. You understand kind of where your career is going, whether you're going to be sort of a happy specialist somewhere in an organization, whether you're going to be a solopreneur, whether you're going to keep climbing the management track, whatever it is. But at this point, your human capital should probably resemble kind of what your long-term outlook is going to be, right? I'm on the management path, I'm on the specialist path, whatever it is. I'm probably going to be doing something like this going forward. Again, there's always an exception. Somebody out there could say, I'm going to go back to school to make a change, but that's a big thing. I think the other thing that happens here is, again, we start to have to live with the consequences of the decisions we made in our 20s and 30s. So we have to, pay to send the kids to school, or we have to start, paying off that mortgage for that house we bought a little bit too late, versus, feeling like our mortgage is half what it was when we started, because we're already 10, 15, 20 years into it. And realistically, our financial reality, the foundations thereof, really starts to set in. We start to have some incumbency bias that starts to dictate and drive our behaviors. And it's not to say that we couldn't get there much earlier, right, depending on our life path, but just recognizing at this point, we're no longer fully flexible. We're no longer in the draft phase where we can just erase certain decisions or claim the mulligan and get a do-over on something. There's probably enough that's been built up over the last 20 years of our lives that we now have some realities that we cannot get around or avoid that will dictate the priorities that we face at that time, unless we are willing to go, I hate to say it, like full deadbeat and just abandon all of our obligations and our family and whatever else to just go do something else, which does happen, but is probably not the ideal path for most people at that stage.
And how do you think that compares to, say, the 50s?
I mean, at the 50s, there's the Gen X gets called the sandwich generation right now, and millennials are on their way to becoming the sandwich generation, because the secret is the sandwich generation problem happens to everybody. As you get into your 50s, if your kids, unless you had kids later on in life, like my dad was 40 when I was born, so he's a good example of this, but like, unless you had kids later on in life, your kids are probably in college or grown and adults at this point. On the other side of that, your family, very likely, your parents, who are probably somewhere between 20 and 30 years older than you in most cases, are getting into their senior years, right? Where maybe we're past the golden age of retirement. We're starting to get into the, through no fault of your own, the warranties are expiring phase of retirement, where we need a little bit more help. We need a little bit more guidance. We need to be, and even if our parents are fully independent financially or health-wise, we're probably just in a position to start paying more attention to their welfare. Right? Seniors are a targeted population for scammers and cons and all sorts of things, because they are recognizably a vulnerable population. So our degree of sort of vigilance around our parents' welfare probably increases around this time. And then beyond this, depending on how we've played out our 20s and 30s and 40s, maybe we're ahead of the curve and we're ready to retire early. Or maybe we are suddenly realizing, crap, my 60s are right around the corner. I'm not ready for that. Like, we have not done the work. We've not done the lifting. The consequences of our own decisions have come around, and we're suddenly realizing that we're uncomfortable with what we've built, and we need to make improvements. So we start to sort of see deviations to the ends of the extremes here. We start to see people who have, quote unquote, done it right, just from a financial standpoint. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, but they've done all the smart things and built a good financial foundation, and they have a lot of options. And we see a lot of people who maybe have struggled to get all the foundations in place throughout their life, and now we're playing catch up, or we're being forced to live with the outcomes of our, inability to save for our kids' college, or the fact that we didn't start our retirement savings until we were in our 40s, and what that's doing to the rest of our life picture.
I think one of the points there that's so important is the fact that this is the sandwich generation. So not only are you probably earning great money and seeing the results of your actions over the last few decades, but your time has probably never been stretched as thin, right? You have children that might still need you, either financially or emotionally or both. You also might have parents that are starting to age, and there might be financial costs you have to incur for that, in addition to just the emotional burden that you might be bearing from your parents starting to get up there in age. It's where some people start to retire, but I'd say the 60s tends to be where the majority of folks start to have this conversation and take action. So whether it's just general retirement or the 60s as a decade, what are we starting to think about here?
I mean, by the time we're getting into our 60s, we're facing the reality that we either can make the transition to financial independence and being work optional, or that we can't, right? And something is limiting us or holding us back from that. And so just recognizing that is going to be something where at this point, time is not going to do the lifting for us if we have not given it the opportunity to do the lifting. Like, we are at the point where we might still put money into retirement accounts or savings accounts, investment accounts, et cetera, and have that with the intent of using that as part of our retirement. But at this point, that money is really more at a point where it's probably going to try to preserve value than it's going to try to create wealth or create, more financial flexibility. It becomes going without versus going without to accumulate. And so in that balance, right, at this stage, the big questions are classic things like, how's our healthcare going to work? How is our retirement going to work? Right? Can we make this transition, this leap? If our parents are still with us, thankfully, right, then our level of vigilance and involvement in their lives has probably gotten a lot more serious. In turn, our kids are probably becoming more independent. and possibly starting to reach their own 20s, 30s. And in that particular framework, now we're being faced with the obligations going the other direction, where even though our kids are grown up, we don't fend for them anymore, take care of them anymore. Now there may be grandkids or a daughter-in-law, son-in-law that we have a relationship with. Now we might be being asked to hand over $10,000-$15,000 to help them with a down payment on their first home. It's like there's all these interesting things where the sandwich thing really shows up in the 50s, but that doesn't mean it goes away in your 60s. And conversely, you are now approaching a point in life where your human capital isn't exhausted, but you may actually be personally exhausted. And so your willingness to use human capital to provide for yourself might be diminishing. And in turn, the necessity to live upon the financial resources you've built is increasing.
It's exciting times. So I'm going to lump the remaining decades together. I'll just call it advanced age. So 70s, 80s, 90s, and even beyond. Are there things at this point that we do consider, or is it just kind of live life as is now?
I mean, the number one question is, am I going to run out of money? And if you've done your adequate financial planning, the answer is no, but that's a risk and a concern that never gets away from you. Assuming that we are not faced with the prospect of running out of money, then it becomes a question of what do we want to enjoy, what quality of life elements are within our means, how do we enjoy this free time and this sort of last opportunity, this last hurrah, as it were, bearing in mind this might be like a 15, 20-year period, right? But to go and do stuff with the time that we have left. And as we get further along, then it just becomes questions about our welfare and maintenance, right? Are we going to be able to support ourselves, or are we going to have to burden our family to some extent with our needs because we were not able to adequately prepare for it? And if we're on the other side of that spectrum where we have more than enough to take care of ourselves, how do we make a meaningful impact in our families' lives or communities' lives in the places or organizations or causes that are meaningful to us while we're still here to make that impact, right? What is the legacy we're going to leave behind?
Well, that's excellent. I think there's a lot of really good things in there. So whether it's all the way from the 20s to the 70s in advanced age, is there anything maybe we haven't touched upon in those decades you want to add here?
There's a whole bunch of stuff that I could pick nits at here, but we're already running long, so I'll stop being so verbose.
Fair enough. I mean, it's something we could talk about all day too, so I don't blame you there. So last topic then here, I want to talk about the difference between one-time financial planning engagements where you may meet with a planner hourly, or they do a plan for you one time and then you take everything they provide you and just run with it, versus what we tend to provide as a service, which is an ongoing relationship throughout years and decades. Is there a type of person that a one-time financial plan might be useful for, or is this maybe just a misalignment of expectations or what people should be viewing for the services?
I think one-time planning, whether it's hourly or a comprehensive project, but it's limited engagement, is a phenomenal offering. I think more people should be taking advantage of that in general, because what most people do instead is come to us, and I'm making that sound like a bad thing, but what I mean by that is they have gone without professional help or guidance or direction for too long a period of their lives, right? They made it through their 20s, their 30s. We get a lot of people coming in their late 40s, somewhere in their 50s, who have never done planning and who are now, and based on this whole conversation we just had about decades, already at the stage of their planning, and their financial status, where they're going to have to live with some of the decisions that have already been made without having the kind of advantage of foresight or the professional guidance. So I say that because I think people in their 20s, people in their 30s absolutely should at the very least pay for an hour of a financial planner's time and just say, hey, tell me what I don't know. Right? Help me just think smartly about what I'm doing in my current situation. Whether you then go on to have a multi-hour conversation or do a planning engagement for a project fee, or you pay $1,000, $2,000 to get a plan built for you, that's great. Because the analogy that I think of here is functionally one-time planning versus ongoing planning is the difference between having a map or a set of directions and having like a GPS. And depending on what you're trying to do or what stage of life you're in, it can make sense to have one or the other, right? If the road ahead of me is pretty straight and I really just need to follow it for the next 10 miles and I don't really need to think about my lefts and my rights and so on, an hourly engagement, a one-time plan can be perfectly appropriate. Keep going this way or make a turn here, but otherwise you're on the right path. Terrific. The ongoing planning thing becomes valuable in that GPS metaphor, call it having a guide with you or whatever it is, insofar as at a certain stage,
it can be hard to keep your eye on the destination with everything going on in your life. And it may make sense to let somebody else drive in that situation or just follow somebody else's lead in that situation so that you can give your attention to the things that are more important to you. So I think, one-time planning is very valuable for everybody at a certain stage. And it can still be valuable for people who are at a stage where they could also benefit from an ongoing relationship. But in turn, the ongoing relationship is valuable because essentially you are delegating responsibility not only for the planning, but also the outcome to this third party. And in that regard, then that allows you to spend more time and energy on the things that maybe you will find more interesting or just want to spend your time on in general.
Okay, so for either one-time engagements or something like an hourly engagement, you see this as a service that typically is geared toward people who like to do the financial planning themselves and just want a tune-up or someone else to check in with a fresh set of eyes, and delegation and ongoing relationship could be typically geared towards someone who doesn't want to be hands-on in all the financial decisions and actions.
I agree with the latter description as far as the ongoing. I want to be careful about the description of one-time planning being good for somebody who wants to do it themselves or who just like needs a tune-up or something. Financial self-efficacy, right, our willingness and capability to get stuff done financially varies wildly amongst people. So there's a lot of people out there who will say things like, I would never hire a financial planner, I'll be fine on my own, or I don't think they're useful or valuable, and so I'm not going to engage with one. But then, 10 years will pass, 20 years will pass, and if they don't find themselves sort of miraculously in the right place financially, they might find themselves talking to a professional who then tells them, hey, you've been not doing this correctly for a long time. So even in the one-time plan context, some people have really high self-efficacy and they can really get some stuff done. They just want some professional check-ins. That's where sort of the check-in, tune-up sort of idea makes sense. But I want people to be really cognizant, right? If you build a plan for yourself, put down some objective benchmarks to help you measure, did I actually get stuff done? Right? Like I said, I was going to save into my retirement and fund my kids' college, and we were going to pay down this credit card, by the end of the next 2 years, and we're not going to overspend on this, that, etc. Like set those down, put a reminder in your calendar out there, and then actually compare. Did I actually do it? Because the truth of the matter is, even for some of our most financially successful, financially intelligent, financially literate clients we work with, I have never, ever, not one time in my practice of financial planner, ever had somebody come in who had a perfect plan, who had been executing flawlessly. It's never happened. And it's not a matter of opinion. I can point to objective metrics and measures that suggest you had the financial resources, you had the means, you had what it was, you knew what you were doing, you just didn't do it, or you didn't do it right. And I have the benefit of hindsight for that, but I can also just say on a forward-looking basis, right? We're talking to somebody right now who I did a one-time plan for back in 2017. And the plan was laid out and they said, good, I'm going to get it done. And now we're talking to them in 2025. And what I'm seeing as we go through the data gathering process with them is they didn't do anything with that information 8 years ago. And so now we've missed out on almost a decade of improvements and enhancements that could have made a material difference in the outcome they're currently experiencing. So that's where I just want to be very careful. I strongly recommend people do one-time hourly engagements early on in life or when they have a particular financial question to get some professional guidance around it. But I also strongly encourage those same people to be very honest with themselves and to put objective measurements in place to help them assess whether they are actually executing and implementing what they need to, or whether they think of themselves as an independent individual who doesn't really have sort of the gusto to get through things.
It's fascinating. You almost have to look at yourself as a third party when you do this, right? So like, okay, there's this person that you're taking care of, and they said they were going to do X, Y, and Z in 3 weeks, and a month has passed and none of it's gotten done. What would you tell that person? But that person is you, right? And you'd say, well, I'd tell them that they should probably get it done now, find someone who can help them and keep track of their responsibilities, right? And there's an abundance of information today. In fact, we've never had more information at our fingertips. We have a computer in our pockets that has the web, YouTube, and a slew of information on all of the topics we've discussed today. But knowledge without actually application or applying the things you learn doesn't get you very far. And there's a ton of folks we work with or come in to speak with us who know what to do or have a good idea of where they should go, but don't actually do the thing, which is just as good as the person who doesn't know anything and doesn't do anything either.
Herein I always think of the great wisdom of SpongeBob, specifically a conversation between Squidward and Mr. Krabs, where Squidward says, "Why do today what you can leave for tomorrow?" And Mr. Krabs replies, "Ah, yes, but what is today but yesterday's tomorrow?" And it is that willingness and that ability to get things done and not leave things for the future, because time is the most finite resource we have.
Couldn't have said it better than that. Shout out to Mr. Krabs.
The wisdom of Mr. Krabs, capitalist and all. So with that in mind, let's ask for your wisdom, Daniel. What have you learned in the last few weeks you'd like to share with our audience before we go?
I'd say just learning the power of staying focused and saying no. Like I said, there's an abundance of information out there and opportunities, but at a certain point, you know what you want to do, what's important to you, what the main things are. And one of the most difficult things is to keep the main things, whether it's investments and seeing all these articles for alternatives or the hot new thing you should be doing, or whether it's just opportunities in your career that might not fit with what's really important to you. It's really important to get good at saying no and just recognizing, where do I want to go? What are the 1 to 3 things I need to do to get there? And what is just noise and something I don't really need to focus on? It's a skill that's easier said than done, right? Nobody wants to say no. We want to be people pleasers, and naturally it's something that is difficult for people. But the better you can get at it, and the better you can get at focusing on what's actually important, the better off you'll be.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.